$6.4 billion. That's how much Canada spent helping build a bridge that stretches between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. And for years, one question kept coming up. Why? Why would Canada agree to spend billions of dollars on a project that doesn't even sit entirely inside Canada? Why would Canadian taxpayers help fund massive infrastructure on the American side of the border? At first glance, it sounds almost unbelievable. But then something happened that suddenly made Canada's decision look a lot smarter. As the Gordie Howe International Bridge moved closer and closer to opening, political tensions between Canada and the United States began rising again. Trade disputes, tariff threats, questions about cross-border cooperation. And suddenly people started asking a different question. What if politics got in the way? What if years of planning could be disrupted at the last minute? After all, this isn't just another bridge. This crossing sits at the center of one of the most important trade corridors in the entire world. Every single day, thousands of trucks move between Canada and the United States through Windsor and Detroit. Auto parts, medical supplies, food, electronics, manufacturing equipment. The modern North American economy depends on goods moving back and forth across this border with incredible speed. Any disruption can create problems that ripple through factories and businesses hundreds of miles away. So when concerns began emerging about political interference, some people worried the bridge could become another battleground in the growing economic tensions between the two countries. But here's the strange part. The concern never really turned into a crisis. The project kept moving forward. Testing continued. Construction continued. Preparations continued. And that's when many observers started asking something else. Was Canada protected all along? Because the deeper you look into this story, the more you realize that the real victory wasn't won recently. It wasn't won in a week. It wasn't won in a month. It was won more than a decade ago. And the reason why starts with a completely different bridge, the Ambassador Bridge. For almost a century, the Ambassador Bridge has been one of the most important border crossings in North America. Opened in 1929, it became the primary connection between Windsor and Detroit. At first, it was a remarkable engineering achievement, but over time, something happened. Trade exploded. The economies of Canada and the United States became more integrated than ever before. Factories on both sides of the border started depending on parts crossing back and forth multiple times during the manufacturing process. A vehicle assembled in Michigan might contain components produced in Ontario. Parts made in Ontario might depend on materials that originally came from the United States. The entire system became interconnected, and almost all of it depended on one aging bridge. That created a problem. Actually, it created several problems. The first was capacity. The Ambassador Bridge wasn't designed for the enormous volume of modern trade. The second was location. On the Canadian side, trucks often had to navigate through urban traffic before reaching major highways. The third problem was perhaps the most important. The bridge was privately owned. Think about that for a moment. One of the most critical trade corridors in North America depended on infrastructure controlled by private interests. For years, government officials on both sides of the border worried about what would happen if there was a major disruption. An accident, a structural issue, an unexpected closure. Anything that slowed traffic could create enormous economic consequences. The solution seemed obvious. Build another bridge. Create redundancy. Increase capacity. Reduce risk. Simple. At least in theory. In reality, it became one of the most complicated infrastructure battles in North American history. Because while governments agreed a new crossing was needed, not everyone wanted competition. The owners of the Ambassador Bridge fought aggressively against plans for a new publicly owned crossing. Legal challenges appeared. Political opposition emerged. Years passed. Then, more years passed. The need for a new bridge became increasingly obvious, yet progress remained painfully slow, and that's where Canada made a decision that changed everything. In 2012, Canada and Michigan signed what became known as the Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement. At the time, many people viewed it as simply another government agreement. In reality, it was much more important than that, Because Canada wasn't just agreeing to build a bridge. Canada was solving a political problem. Michigan lawmakers were reluctant to commit billions of dollars to the project. Without funding, the bridge could remain stuck in limbo indefinitely. So Canada proposed something remarkable. Canada would finance the project, not just Canada's portion, almost everything: the bridge itself, the customs facilities, the highway connections, the supporting infrastructure. Canada would provide the upfront money required to make the project happen. For many observers, the proposal seemed extraordinary. Why would Canada take on such a massive financial burden? The answer becomes clear once you understand what Canada was really buying. It wasn't simply purchasing a bridge. It was purchasing certainty. It was eliminating delays. It was removing political obstacles. And perhaps most importantly, it was securing the future of one of Canada's most important economic corridors. Because every year the project remained stalled, carried its own costs: congestion costs, efficiency costs, lost opportunities, economic risks. Canada looked at the situation and concluded that waiting might be more expensive than acting. So Ottawa acted. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. Canada didn't simply write a check and hope for the best. The agreement was carefully designed. Revenue from future tolls would help recover costs over time. Governance structures were established. Legal protections were included. Responsibilities were clearly defined. Everything was designed to make the project difficult to derail. At the time, many people probably didn't realize just how important those legal protections would become. Because once the agreement was signed, the real battle began. For years, legal challenges continued. Court cases appeared, objections were filed, arguments stretched across multiple jurisdictions. The project seemed trapped in a cycle of lawsuits and delays. But something interesting kept happening. The agreement held again and again, challenge after challenge, obstacle after obstacle. The legal foundation remained intact. And slowly, the opposition started running out of options. By the late 2010s, the path forward was finally becoming clear. Construction could begin. What followed was one of the largest infrastructure projects ever undertaken along the Canada-US border. The scale was staggering. 2 massive towers rising more than 200 meters into the air, a main span stretching 853 meters across the Detroit River, 6 traffic lanes, modern customs facilities, direct highway connections, a pedestrian and cycling path. Virtually every aspect of the project was designed to improve efficiency and capacity. And unlike the Ambassador Bridge, this crossing would connect directly into major transportation networks. That matters more than many people realize. In logistics, minutes matter. A delay of 15 minutes might sound insignificant. But multiply that across thousands of trucks every day, and the economic impact becomes enormous. Manufacturers understand this. Supply chain managers understand this. Transportation companies understand this. Small improvements in efficiency can create huge benefits over time. That's one reason why so many businesses have been eagerly awaiting the bridge's opening. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because as construction progressed, the bridge gradually transformed from an infrastructure project into something else. A symbol. A symbol of long-term planning. A symbol of economic cooperation. And perhaps most importantly, a symbol of what happens when governments decide to solve a problem instead of arguing about it forever. Think about the timeline. The agreement was signed in 2012. Construction began years later. The bridge is only now approaching full operation. That's more than a decade between decision and completion. In today's political environment, where attention spans often last only days, that's remarkable, and it reveals something important. Major infrastructure doesn't happen because of headlines. It happens because of persistence, because people continue working even after public attention moves elsewhere, because agreements survive changes in governments, because long-term planning eventually produces tangible results. And that may be the most fascinating part of the entire story. The bridge exists today because people made decisions years before most of the current political debates even existed. When the agreement was signed, nobody knew what future trade disputes might look like. Nobody knew what future administrations would prioritize. Nobody knew what future challenges would emerge, yet the framework they created proved strong enough to survive all of it. That's why the idea of a sudden crisis often misses the bigger picture. The real story isn't that Canada won a quick political battle. The real story is that Canada spent years making sure it wouldn't have to fight one. The agreement reduced uncertainty. The financing solved a deadlock. The legal structure created stability. And together, those decisions transformed an ambitious idea into a nearly completed reality. Today, as the Gordie Howe International Bridge prepares to handle traffic, it represents far more than steel and concrete. It represents resilience. It represents strategic thinking. And it represents a lesson that many governments around the world continue struggling to learn. Sometimes the most important victory doesn't happen when a crisis appears. Sometimes the most important victory happens years earlier, when someone quietly creates a plan that prevents the crisis from succeeding in the first place. And that may be the real legacy of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Not simply that Canada helped build one of the largest bridges in North America, but that Canada built a framework strong enough to carry the project through years of political battles, legal challenges, and uncertainty. When the first trucks begin crossing in large numbers, they'll be traveling across one of the most advanced trade corridors on the continent. But they'll also be traveling across something much less visible. A 14-year-old agreement that quietly did exactly what it was designed to do. Keep the bridge moving forward, no matter what happened around it.